Hi everyone, I'm Shaylin here with Reedsy. Around a year ago, you might remember we did a deep dive into the brainstorming and book development process, and now we're going to be doing a deep dive into the editing process, and over the next 5 weeks throughout the month of May, we're going to be tackling the editing process. Across our YouTube comments, Instagram comments, Q&A questions, just all across the board, editing is probably the topic that you guys seem to have the most questions on. And as a writer, I totally relate to that. The editing process can seem very overwhelming. It can be really hard to know how to approach it, how to tackle it, what to do, where to even begin. So I hope that by the end of this series, you will feel prepared to tackle the editing for your book. So our syllabus is going to look a little like this. In our first video, we're going to be talking about assessing your manuscript. In part 2, we're going to be talking about content and developmental editing. In part 3, we're going to be talking about line editing. In part 4, we're going to be talking about getting feedback on your work. And in part 5, we're going to be talking about working with a professional editor. I'll leave a playlist in the cards with the entire series once it's all been posted. If you're watching the series as it airs, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss each new episode. Alright, so let's get started. You've written a book. That's kind of only half the battle. Now you need to edit it. Before you start actually diving into your edits and making changes, you're going to need to assess your manuscript. Remember that editing is not a one-size-fits-all process. Every book is going to require different changes because every book is going to have different issues that need attention and that need fixing. And so it only makes sense that your editing process is going to be pretty individual to the needs of your manuscript. That's why it's really important to figure out what direction you want to take the manuscript before you start actually editing it. So you want to go in with a game plan. If you don't know where to begin and you've just finished the first draft, it can help to start by just taking a break. A few weeks away from your manuscript can help you get a lot of ideas and gain a lot of fresh perspective. You'll come back with fresher eyes, and in that time, you'll likely start to have thoughts about things you can change, things you can add, ways to tighten up the manuscript, ideas that can only really come with a little bit of distance. Start keeping a running list of changes that you want to make to the manuscript. If you're really lost, you might even want to read it over as a reader would. Set aside a few days. If you have an e-reader, you can, upload it onto your e-reader as a PDF, but try to read it in just a few days span to get an overall perspective like a reader would. As you're reading your book or as you're just reflecting on your book, here are some things to ask yourself. Now keep in mind, this isn't an exhaustive list. This doesn't account for every single possible issue a book might have. The issues in your book might be very individual to the book, but these are some good things to ask yourself, more general problems that can apply to a lot of stories. So first, let's look at the characters. Does your main character have a goal with an internal motivation? This is really the backbone of a story, so if this is missing, it's definitely something you want to attend to. Are there any characters that aren't contributing to the story or could be cut or combined into one character? It's very common to have excess characters, and a lot of the time you can do a bit of pruning or even just combine multiple characters into one. Are all the core character relationships given adequate development? Have you explored your protagonist's backstory in enough detail? It can be easy to kind of forget about the backstory, skim over it a little bit too much while you're writing the first draft, but on the flip side, some people focus a little too heavily on the backstory and provide more backstory than is needed. Does your character have internal flaws, and are they challenged by the story? And how does your main character change from beginning till end? What about the plot? Start by identifying your main plot points. Does your story have an inciting incident? Does it have a midpoint? Does it have a climax? If it's missing any of those key things, you might be missing an important structural beat, especially if there's no inciting incident or no climax. A story without these two things is often not really a story, since they signal that the story has a beginning and that the story has an end. Is the beginning too exposition heavy? This is a pretty common problem. Does the middle lack tension or direction? This is also a fairly common problem known as a mushy middle. Are there places throughout the middle that you could simplify the chain of events? Places where the story has just been overly convoluted? Is the ending the result of events set out throughout the beginning and the middle, or does it come out of nowhere? Are there important plot developments introduced too late that might make the end unsatisfying? Are there any scenes that can be cut without harming the story? You'll probably have at least one of those, probably several. It's hard to write a whole book without having at least one, probably many extraneous scenes. Or maybe you have multiple scenes that are serving the same purpose and can be combined and condensed into one. Are there any plot holes or things that just don't make sense? Are there places where the pacing is too fast or too slow? or just incongruous with the rest of the story? Are there events that happen without consequence? So just kind of isolated events that happen and then their effect on the story is never explored. Are there any deus ex machinas or overly convenient plot points? If you're worried your book has a deus ex machina, I'll leave a link to our video on deus ex machina for you to check out. And finally, what about continuity errors? It's really easy to thread through continuity errors. You'll likely pick up even more as you start actually line editing the book, but if there are any you're aware of now, take note of them. Okay, so what about the world and the setting? The prevalence of world building in your book might depend on the genre. For a fantasy, sci-fi, or historical fiction book, the world building is going to be incredibly important. If you're writing in the genre where the setting isn't as much in the forefront, maybe something like a thriller or a contemporary novel, setting and world is still important, but it probably won't be as much of an issue. It's unlikely that you have major issues with setting in a contemporary world where there isn't much world building. There might be issues with the setting, for example, it's not described enough, it's described too much, little continuity errors, but you probably don't have deep-seated world building issues that will have a lasting effect on the plot, just because the setting isn't as integral to the plot line as it would be in a book with pretty heavy world building. There are still questions to ask yourself about the world, no matter what genre your book is or where it's set. First of all, do you have adequate setting description? Is the world easy to picture? Are there any plot holes caused by the setting? Especially if you're writing something that's historical, even if it's pretty recently historical, fact check everything. You never know when suddenly like your characters have something that hasn't even been invented yet. What about inconsistent world building? You might have a lack of world building, especially in a genre like fantasy or sci-fi where the world is really important. Maybe that hasn't been explored enough. Or on the flip side, maybe there's overly dense world building. Too much world building, or the world building just isn't being handled with enough subtlety. Now, what about theme? Theme may be something that you thought of a lot while writing the first draft. It may have been something that you didn't even consider. There's no right or wrong way to approach theme, but now that you've written a manuscript, it's pretty likely that a theme has emerged whether you intended it to or not. It's actually kind of hard to write a book without some themes emerging. So take stock of them. First, you want to ask yourself, are there any contradictory thematic points? So is the story kind of trying to balance two contradictory themes, or is there a theme but it's saying contradictory things about the theme at once? Do the events hold meaning for the character's growth? Once you've started to identify the theme, and this is probably tied to your character arc, if you can identify the theme and the character arc, you want to make sure that the events that happen hold meaning for the character's arc. So they're what's contributing to the character's arc, they're what's causing it, pushing it, developing it, and therefore the theme is tied to the events of the story. And are there any important ideas that are present but aren't being explored? It's pretty likely, if you've written a whole book, that ideas have cropped up that you weren't even anticipating. It might be worth doing a bit of a deeper dive into some of these ideas to see the impact and the extra depth they can add to your story. And finally, let's talk about style. Are there any point of view shifts? Is the voice and writing style consistent? It's pretty likely that your character's voice has developed and changed as you wrote the book, as you got to know the character better. So there might be some differences in voice at the beginning compared to the end. And are there inconsistencies in scene or chapter style, unless this is something you want to do intentionally? Now, a lot of these problems will be hard or impossible to identify on your own, and they'll be picked up later on by critique partners or by an editor. You don't need to have the answer to every single one of these questions. We're going to talk about working with critique partners and editors later on. For now, we're focusing on the self-edit. Now would probably not be a good time to hire a professional editor. Remember, you will hike your editing costs quite a lot if you work with an editor too soon, because the manuscript will be in an earlier stage of development. It'll need to go through more editing work. So you can save yourself a lot of money by doing editing before you hire an editor. But it may be an appropriate time to work with a critique partner. If you have someone that you have like a good critiquing rapport with and you're comfortable sending each other early drafts, maybe you want to pass it on to them now to get their assessment. Remember, editing happens in layers. It's kind of like painting a wall. The first coat of paint might be kind of patchy, and as you go, each layer of paint will fill in the wall more and more and more. until it looks nice and crisp and smooth. You don't have to fix every single issue on the first pass. In fact, you probably won't be able to. You probably won't be able to identify every issue. So do what you can. The more you can fix now, the more you'll be able to identify other issues in later drafts, the easier it will be to fix other issues. It's almost impossible to fix everything at once, so don't worry about fixing everything at once. Just take stock of what you can fix and work on that. Okay, so I'm gonna run you guys through a quick exercise. This is pretty simple stuff, but it's gonna give you a good foundation going forward. So these are some materials that you can create to help you assess your manuscript, and it'll just make your editing process a lot easier. So the first thing you're gonna do is a detailed plot summary, and this is gonna be a full plot summary of all the events in the story. It'll probably be a couple pages long, probably several thousand words. While you're doing this, you might run into places where you realize you can condense the timeline. You might run into places where there's a plot hole. You might realize certain things are redundant. Writing out a plot summary in zoomed out form can really help you assess the manuscript. After that, you want to write a pitch or a jacket description. Kind of a summary of the book like you would find on your book's Amazon or Goodreads page or on the back jacket. So it's not going to reveal all of the events, but it's going to be kind of eye-catching and snappy. This will really help you hone in on the purpose of your book, what you're trying to say. If you're lacking fundamental things like a character's goal or even a theme, it might be really hard to write this summary, but you also might discover some of these things while you're writing the summary. It can also really help if you haven't written one to write a log line, just a one-sentence log line to really hone in your vision of the book. Again, you may have done this all before you started writing the book. Why would you be doing it now after the first draft? And it's because now that you've finished the draft, you've actually created the thing you set out to create, and it's actually pretty likely that it's changed or shifted, and you probably have a more solid understanding of the book's purpose than you did before you started writing it. And I would also recommend writing quick one-paragraph summary for all of the character arcs. So any of the characters who go through significant character arcs, write a summary of their character development and their character arc. Again, this is something that's going to be really useful for you as a tool while you're editing. Having these materials will help you identify your vision for the book now that it's done and how you want to revise it. You need to know the end point, right? What are you revising towards? When you're writing the first draft, you're working towards having a completed manuscript. You have that endpoint, and it can help to have that endpoint when you're editing. So know what you're trying to achieve with the editing. And these tools will all give you solid reference points to help you while you're revising. You're gonna have to make decisions like, should I cut this scene? Should I add a scene here? And you can ask yourself, okay, wait, based on what I wrote in my summaries, this scene doesn't contribute to the character's arc, so maybe it can go. Stuff like that. So you've gathered a lot of materials and you've assessed your manuscript. This is the first step. We're going to end part 1 here. In the next part, we're going to be talking about content editing. So this is the developmental editing. We're going to talk about revising the plot and the characters. We're going to take all of the material that we did today, and we're going to actually start working on the manuscript. So if you haven't subscribed or turned on notifications, do so you don't miss that video or any future videos. I publish new writing, editing, and publishing videos usually twice a week on this channel, but during this series just once a week. So thank you so much for watching. Stick around for the next video in the series, and I'll see you next week.